I am here to represent Sutrue. Sutrue designs medical devices that do stitches automatically, medical sutures, in a range of different sizes and needle types. We have 2 examples of the device here, but we're now up to 5 handheld examples, an endoscopic and a robotic version. The device is to replace handheld suturing, which is done by 2 needle drivers, basically forceps that have to grab the needle. And we've replaced it with a mechanized version which can rotate a needle at a standard speed and force and consistently at the same angle. This is the completed version of our large handheld device. It can power a needle approximately with twice as much force as can be done by hand. And our smaller version, which is slightly out of focus, you can see size of a penny. Internally, in this particular version, there were 58 internal components. So in the development of this, we predominantly use 3D printing and laser etching. This is one example of one part. Just in 2015, the number of examples that we were able to do with the cost difference of doing something with modern techniques. The previous example, which was our first prototype, took 6 months to develop, to machine, and cost £1,500. We can now 3D print this within a week for about £20. Conventionally, to start off with, we were using commercially sourced gears for our drivetrain, but also we were using tongue piercings. So we needed a ball and a shaft that was used within the mechanism to be able to rotate the gear, and found that that was the best way to do it. We've now moved on to 3D printing, and you can see the scale here, and the precision of the 3D printing that you can do in metal with a comparison of a penny. And here is an example of the top of 2 parts. Those 2 parts, the outer part is only 2.2 millimeters across. So you can see the detail that's there. In combination, put together with other 3D printed parts in plastic, you can create a fully functioning working prototype that can then be tested by medics, developed, retested, new components made by a cost effectiveness about 100 times less than conventional manufacturing. We use a Formlabs, which we have here with us. So most of our plastic components were made with a relatively new machine. It's a desktop machine. And as an example, that device with the Formlabs, all of the plastic components bespoke to what we wanted to make would have been less than £20, so 30 euros or 30 US dollars. It allows you to be able to develop something, and change it with very little cost. It frees up the development process. This is, previous one. These are the metal 3D printed parts. Again, cost effective. Several versions of different components that can be tested, so you can find out which is the best component. Each one of those components, if they were conventionally manufactured, would have cost approximately £20,000 in molding tools, whereas each one of these is about £3. This is the head of our endoscopic device, so again you can see the scale of it. Inside that head are 34 components, all 3D printed, all capable of driving a needle, which you can see poking out. And that needle can go around at about 3 times per second. The parts are precise enough to be able to allow that. And that head will have cost less than £100 to print. This is a great image of a part that looks enormous, but you have to bear in mind at the top of that part, each one of those little teeth is the width of a hair. So it's 40 microns. So you can now print details that are to that degree. They're curvilinear, so they curve in 2 directions. And again, those parts are, in US terms, less than $10. We now have Mr. Trimmett, who was here earlier on, and Professor Pepper on this particular day were testing our device. Interestingly, they did 15 stitches in a row there. And the comment that Professor Pepper made was that it had taken about 3 minutes. When we went back over the video and timed it, it had taken nearly exactly half that time. So an experienced surgeon, a professor of medicine, and a heart surgeon, in understanding the normal procedure of doing a stitch, it's half the time that they'd expected it to take with a new device. Recently we were on BBC Click, so the BBC do a tech show every week where they filmed us using the device with the Royal Brompton Hospital. Again, a version of the device, these are actually the older components, so that image can move on. But we were filmed by BBC in a clinical setting. We used all of the different versions of our device. Afterwards, we actually worked on a pig's heart, which isn't necessarily something people want to see. But that started off our run towards looking at advertising and marketing. And you get to see the pig's heart. So again, this is Richard trying it out on heart tissue. This particular version of the device is quite brutal because it has a needle called a cutting needle, but still able to suture heart tissue very delicately. And we also use one of the other versions of our device, which has a much smaller needle. Demonstrated, made by 3D printing, very little cost for development, and still able to function in a clinical setting. So we're now moving on to our very small components. You can see this is one of our recent components that's been printed. It's slightly out of focus because it's so small, but the gear teeth on this component, each tooth is only 0.4 millimeters long. So to get a scale of sense of there, just think of each one of the teeth as being 0.4 millimeters. It's about 10 times a hair. Finally, some of the other components, this is a working universal joint. So a universal joint is a mechanical joint that can change the direction of a rotating object. We think that possibly this is the smallest universal joint ever made. This is 2.8 millimeters in diameter. The smallest we found is 5 millimeters. And again, 3D printed. Quite difficult to put together, but because it has 7 components in that. But I think maybe we've beaten the record for a functioning universal joint. Okay. Telephone. Oh, and this up? Yep. And that's the work we're doing at the moment. We're looking at 3D printing costs being approximately 100 times less than conventional costs of manufacturing. Within the next 2 weeks, we're going to be hopefully testing all of these devices with some very accomplished robotic surgeons. We only got these components 3 days ago, so we have a week to put them together. And in that week, if any of them go wrong, we can have them reprinted and ready to install in time for testing in 10 days. So the procedure of being able to do prototyping and to install and get ready for clinical trials is taken from maybe a 2 or 3 year period of time down to 2 weeks, and purely because of 3D printing. So, thank you very much.